I'm 93 years old. I was married to my husband, James, for 61 years before he passed. And what I'm about to tell you is going to make you hate me at first. Give me 5 minutes. By the end you might thank me. In those early years, I looked at James and saw a man who was failing to meet a standard that didn't even exist. My resentment was a slow-growing thing. Fed by the 1,000 little ways he wasn't like the heroes in the books I read or the movies I watched. I was 26 years old. He snored with a rhythmic, thunderous intensity that stole my sleep. He worked late, coming home with heavy eyes and nothing left for me, leaving me to sit in a silence that felt like an insult. I saw his absence at the dinner table as a choice to ignore me. I was ready to burn the house down because the walls weren't the right shade of perfect. I was standing in a beautiful, sturdy home, but all I could see were the scratches. I was ready to walk away. I sat in the lawyer's office with a heavy heart and a folder full of reasons why I was done. He was an old man, well into his 60s, with a face lined by the stories of 1,000 broken families. I expected him to hand me a pen and a set of papers that would magically erase my misery. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair and asked me a single piercing question. "Mrs. Evelyn, what exactly do you think you're leaving?" I snapped back that I was leaving an unhappy marriage, a man who didn't listen, and a life that felt like a dead end. He didn't flinch at my anger. He just looked at me with a kind of pity that made me feel even smaller. "No," he said calmly. "You're leaving the first chapter. You haven't even gotten to the good part yet." I wanted to argue, but the truth in his words felt like a physical weight. He wasn't saying my pain wasn't real. He was saying my pain was a season, not a final destination. He told me that if I left now, I'd just be trading one set of frustrations for another, never staying long enough to see what a life built on endurance actually looks like. I left his office without signing anything. I went home and decided to give it one more year, not because I felt love, but because I was suddenly terrified of being the person who walks away right before the story finally gets interesting. I went home, but I didn't go back to the fairy tale. I went back to the cleanup. That lawyer's words had stripped away the glitter of the ceremony, leaving me standing in the wreckage of a normal Tuesday. I realized then that I had been in love with a party, not a person. The wedding was a stage production. Flowers that didn't wilt, music that never hit a sour note, and a James who looked at me like I was the only soul on earth. But the marriage was the quiet, unglamorous hours after the guests had gone home and the music had stopped. It was the dishes piled in the sink while we were both too tired to speak. It was the bills on the counter and the grit of daily life that gets under your skin. I had expected the high of the altar to be the permanent altitude of our lives, but I was learning that you can't live on a mountain peak forever. Nothing grows there. The growth happens in the valley, in the dirt of the cleanup. I started to look at James differently. He wasn't the man who had failed to keep the party going. He was the man who stayed to help me sweep the floors. I realized that by wanting to leave because things got boring or hard, I was essentially throwing away a diamond because it was still covered in the earth it was mined from. James wasn't my happily ever after. He was my partner in the messy, beautiful, exhausting work of building a life. That year, I stopped waiting for him to surprise me with flowers and started noticing how he made sure my car had gas. I stopped looking for the feeling of love and started looking for the fact of it. The fact was that he was there. He was tired, he was flawed, and he still snored, but he was still standing in the kitchen with me after the party ended. My 30s were the decade where the fog of fantasy finally began to lift, replaced by a reality that was far less cinematic but infinitely more substantial. I had spent my 20s comparing James to a ghost, an imaginary version of a husband who was always attentive, always romantic, and never tired. I realized that for years, I had been punishing a good man for not being a fictional one. I looked at him in the mornings, not the groomed, smiling man from our wedding photos, but a man with messy hair and morning breath, leaning over a cup of coffee before heading to a job that wore him down. The expectation problem the lawyer warned me about became a daily battle. I had to learn to kill the girl who wanted a movie romance so the woman could love a real man. He didn't bring me roses every Friday, but he was the one who checked the tire pressure on my car every Sunday. He didn't write me poems, but he stood at the sink and washed the heavy pots after I'd spent the day wrangling 2 toddlers. The fantasy whispered that I was settling, but the truth was that I was finally settling in. I wasn't married to a prince, and I wasn't a princess. We were just 2 flawed people trying to keep a roof over our heads and a promise to each other, and for the first time that was enough. The transition into our 40s and 50s was a slow, quiet shifting of the tectonic plates of our relationship. We stopped being 2 individuals fighting for our own territory and finally became a team. It was the decade where we traded the need to be right for the necessity of being understood. In our younger years, every disagreement was a trial where I had to prove James was the villain. If he was late, I was the victim. If he was silent, I was the neglected. But as the gray began to touch his temples and the lines deepened around my eyes, I started to see the absence I once resented as a profound sacrifice. I stopped looking at the empty chair at the dinner table as a sign that he didn't care about me. I saw it as a sign of how hard he was working to ensure our children had the life we never did. We stopped keeping score. There is no faster way to kill a marriage than by tallying up who did the most laundry or who made the most sacrifices. I remember a Tuesday night somewhere in our late 50s, when we sat in the kitchen after a particularly grueling day. James had made a mistake with the bills, and old Evelyn would have used that as ammunition to prove his incompetence. But new Evelyn, the one who had survived the winters, simply reached across the table and took his hand. I saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, and instead of a critique, I gave him grace. We had finally moved past the power struggle of the middle years. We weren't trying to change each other anymore. We were just trying to hold each other up. By our 60s and 70s, James and I had stopped talking about the future and started inhabiting a world that only the 2 of us truly understood. We had developed what I call a secret language. It wasn't made of words you'd find in a dictionary. It was built from 40 years of shared glances, half-finished sentences, and inside jokes that would make no sense to our children or neighbors. We could have an entire conversation across a crowded room without ever opening our mouths. This was the reward for the cleanup I had resisted in my 20s. But this decade also brought the ultimate test of our pact. When the doctor sat us down and said the word cancer, the world didn't end with a bang. It slowed down to an agonizing crawl. For the first time, our roles shifted in a way that left no room for the ego. I watched the man who used to irritate me with his snoring become a man who sat by my hospital bed for 18 hours a day, holding my hand until his own went numb. He didn't offer platitudes or movie script speeches. He just stayed. He learned how to cook the 3 things I could keep down, and he learned how to navigate the silence of a house that felt too large when I was too weak to walk through it. In those hospital hallways, I realized that the perfect marriage I had chased at 29 would have shattered under this pressure. A fantasy husband doesn't know how to change a bandage or look at a sickly woman and still see a bride. Only a man you have fought with, forgiven, and chosen for 40 years knows how to do that. We were battle-worn and weary, but we were unified. The secret language we spoke wasn't just about jokes anymore. It was the silent code of two souls who had promised to stay until the very end, and were finally seeing that promise through. By the time we reached our late 70s, the world's greatest lie, the myth of the soulmate, had finally crumbled under the weight of our shared history. He was my soulmate because I had refused to leave him for 60 years. We weren't two halves of a whole. We were two whole, jagged people who had spent decades sanding down our sharp edges against one another until we finally fit. I realized that the radical truth about love is that it isn't a feeling you find. It is a choice you make every single day, especially on the days when you don't feel like it. I looked back at that 29-year-old version of myself who thought love was a chemical reaction that should happen to her effortlessly. Real love is actually a form of stubbornness. It is the decision to look at the person who just hurt your feelings and say, "I am staying anyway." You don't fall out of love. You stop choosing it. You stop watering the garden and then act surprised when the flowers die. In our 70s, James and I were living in a garden that was lush and deep. We had spent 50 years pulling the weeds of resentment and bitterness before they could take root. We didn't find the perfect love. We built it with our bare hands. Most people assume that by the time you've been together for 50 or 60 years, the struggle is over, but that is the greatest misconception of all. We hit a season where the air between us went cold and thin. It wasn't a period of explosive fighting, it was worse. It was a period of nothing. I would look at James across the breakfast table and feel absolutely no spark, no warmth, not even the comforting hum of friendship. I felt like I was living with a polite stranger. This is the stage where most modern couples walk away. But having lived through 80 years of seasons, I knew better. I knew that marriage is like the earth itself. It must have a winter. I didn't feel like choosing James. I didn't feel like being kind. But the secret I had learned is that you don't wait for the feeling to return before you act. You act so that the feeling has a reason to return. I watered the brown grass. I made his tea exactly how he liked it. We stayed through the cold. And then, as surely as the tilt of the planet, the thaw began. A small joke at dinner led to a real laugh. Suddenly the nothing was gone, replaced by a spring that was greener and more vibrant than any we had experienced in our youth. The danger of marriage isn't the fighting, it's the winter. And the only way to survive the winter is to stay until it's over. James has been gone for 4 years now, and I find myself sitting on the porch of the life we built, looking out at the horizon. People ask me if I'm lonely, and I tell them no, I am full. I am full of 61 years of shared breaths, of winters survived, and of the quiet, invincible peace that only comes to those who refuse to run. The final truth about divorce that no one admits until it's too late is that when you leave a marriage because it got hard or boring, you aren't just leaving a person. You are leaving your own history. You are cutting off the branch you were meant to grow on. At 93, I realized that the good part of marriage isn't the beginning, and it isn't even the middle. The good part is the end. It is the moment when you look at the person beside you and realize that they are the only other person on this planet who remembers the way your children looked as infants, the way the light hit your first kitchen, and the way it felt to bury your parents. Love returns like the tide. That is the one thing I wish I could scream from the rooftops to every young person ready to sign those papers. You think the tide is gone forever because the sand is dry and the water is a mile away. But if you just stay on the shore, if you just keep standing there, stubborn and patient, the water always comes back. And when it returns, it is deeper and more powerful than the wave that came before it. I almost left at 29. I almost traded 61 years of springs for a temporary escape from a winter. If I had, I would be sitting here today with a different life perhaps, but I wouldn't have this soul. I wouldn't know the profound, holy silence of being truly known by another human being for a lifetime.